72 years trying to reach peace and only having 2 partners. In 4 months, we got partner number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6.
Shelves full of books called The Arab-Israeli Conflict, The Israel-Arab Conflict. Potentially, those books are no longer. The Arab-Israeli conflict, at this moment in time, there's a big question over that. Is there an Arab-Israeli conflict? Because we see a potential for a shift that is so deep, understanding that what unites us far, far outweighs what divides us, and our shared values and our shared history.
The UAE and Bahrain signed bilateral agreements with Israel in September of 2020. In October, Israel and Sudan normalized relations as well.
Sudan and Israel have agreed to normalize their diplomatic relations. And now Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced that in the coming days, a delegation of Israeli envoys will visit Sudan to completely formalize the deal.
When broadening diplomatic relationships between nations, it is often necessary to rely on security relationships that have been quietly at work behind the scenes. The identities of security personnel are most often kept confidential.
I remember when we landed in Sudan for the first time with no cover, no backup, nobody knew we were going there. And I remember they gave us these satellite phones that we can call anybody in the world and we would be perfectly fine. And we land, and I turn on my satellite phone. There's no battery in the satellite phone. I'm like, oh my God, I did not want to get off the airplane. And you put your arm around me and says, don't worry about it, you're with me. And we walked immediately into the presidential palace. We were treated royally, but there was that trust immediately in the eyes of the leadership there, and they knew that when they were dealing with you, you spoke directly on behalf of the Prime Minister of Israel.
You need to understand that you're going to some place that no Israeli has been official. In my previous work, when you go to some place, you got a lot of security around you. A lot. Okay, you feel safe sometimes, but I think you feel safe better if you trust the other guy. When you got the trust and you got the contact, it's good enough to do almost everything. When we go to the other countries, for the new country, it's a new country totally. We strongly need the US because Israel alone cannot do a lot. They don't have the research and the...
It's a 9 million person country.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, but they need the US much more.
Much more.
Much more. They prefer the US contact than other contacts. When you sit a new country that considered to be your enemy or something like that, and you put up the phone and you call your friends from the US and it's answered and you speak like a friend, that's mean everything.
In December, Morocco joined the Accords.
Morocco is the latest Arab country after the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Sudan to normalize ties with Israel.
By El Al Airlines, non-stop from Tel Aviv to Rabat, Israel ushers in its normalization with the 6th Arab country and 4 in the last 4 months.
After spending 72 years trying to reach peace and only having 2 partners, in 4 months, we got partner number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6.
Although the 7th treaty was not technically part of the Abraham Accords, in February of 2021, Israel established its first diplomatic ties with a Muslim-majority country in Europe, the nation of Kosovo.
Well, Donald Trump may be out of office, but the momentum he created among countries normalizing ties with Israel is not dying out just yet. Israel and Kosovo will establish full diplomatic relations this week in a virtual signing ceremony with Israel's Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi. Israel has agreed in exchange to recognize Kosovo's independence.
a great move by Kosovo government and Israeli government, intermediated by US.
Across these countries, embassies and missions opened for the very first time, or reopened for the first time in decades.
Kosovo says it'll put its embassy in Jerusalem.
This morning I received your formal request, Madam Minister, to open your embassy in Jerusalem, which of course I approve.
Israel's mission to Morocco reopened this week after 20 years of being shut.
The Israeli consulate in Dubai also opened 2 days after the Israeli embassy in the United Arab Emirates opened in Abu Dhabi, its capital.
When I got out of the elevator and I saw the sign, Embassy of the State of Israel, it hit me. You know, the results of the Abraham Accords right here. I mean, there's nothing more tangible than an embassy, you know, with an Israeli flag in a country that had no relations with Israel until just a few months ago.
For me, it's still a wonder. I get up in the morning and pinch myself. It's still the talk of the town.
When was the last time Israel opened an embassy in 2 months? So
during COVID.
And during COVID, yes.
The synergy is amazing. Really, areas of cooperation span from space to the National Archives, I mean, and everything in between. There are flights, there are Israelis visiting here. You can hear Hebrew here in restaurants, in the hotels. Soon we'll open a corridor for tourists to visit both countries.
It's easier for me to get a kosher sandwich in Abu Dhabi than in Washington, D.C.
I think that's so great.
Isn't that amazing?
And everywhere we go, you know, people ask questions about Jewish traditions, Jewish practices. It's fascinating. It comes from, you know, being a century apart.
We want people to take it for granted that Jews and Christians and Muslims can live together and respect each other's religions and live, you know, differently, but live together. I want to thank you for the part you're playing in doing that.
As an Israeli, and as an Israeli diplomat who's been on the job for 30 years, well, I would like to thank you on behalf of a grateful nation for your contribution. You as America invested so much in resources, in material aid, in human lives to make this region peaceful. America, it was heavily involved in making peace between Israel and Egypt, the Camp David Accord, peace between Israel and Jordan. And now, without American, really magnificent statecraft, the Abrahamic Accords wouldn't have happened. I think that we are too close yet to the event to fully appreciate what has happened. We're developing something very unique, a model of peace for others in the region to see and to ask themselves, and I'm quoting here His Highness Sheikh Abdallah, the Foreign Minister of this country, asking themselves, why not us? You know, blessed are the peacemakers. Now, we may differ on the way sometimes on how to make peace happen, but you cannot argue with success.
We can have this relationship with Israel where we can trade and invest and do research and get to know each other, but also have political disagreements. And I think that's the path we've chosen. And hopefully that breaks the mindset that we've had in the Middle East for the last several decades, where it's we're not going to talk to them, we're not going to engage because of something. And that something is still there. We can still address it, but we can address it while we're actually at the table.
They're neighbors, they live close to each other. So up to this point, they've not been communicating. And how important that is, I think, can't be overstated. Because in difficult situations, it's communication that deflates it and de-escalates it. Now they're equipped to do that because they can communicate with each other. We have now more effective neighbors working together in ways they've not done before. The likelihood of us having to send someone else to go repeat this is less likely because of it. Ultimately, what I'd like to do is to pass on to the next person behind me, to the next generation, to my children, to your children, and to our country, a better situation than we found it. I would not want, my children or their children to have to go and repeat and do what I did, or friends I know, and not come back. What we've done here will make it less likely others will have to pay that price and leave their lives in another part of the world far from home.
We need to look at the past 70 or so years as an aberration in Jewish-Islamic relations, not as the rule. This sort of Jewish-Arab hatred that we have seen, how much of it has been influenced by politics? If you go back and you really look at Arab writings prior to the creation of State of Israel, do you see that same sort of stereotyping, etc.? Of course not. I mean, there was a little here and there, but we know that politics can change things to the better or to the worse. And I think with the Abrahamic Accords, we're trying to change things to the better.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
The Abraham Accords were both celebrated and criticized by the larger international community. Skeptics wondered what these agreements would look like in practice, especially when a meaningful conflict arose. Those tests were yet to come, although the world would not have to wait long. In the interim, more embassies opened. More tourists and business people traveled where they had been prohibited from traveling before. Citizens, and not just politicians, took the meaning and the opportunity of the Abraham Accords into their own hands.
Tens of thousands of Israelis and Emiratis and Bahrainis were visiting one another. By the way, half of the Israelis that traveled to the Emirates were Arab Israelis.
Right.
That's astounding. That is the path forward internally as well. That's hope.
We are all children of Abraham. Abraham asked Allah to make this region safe, secure, and prosperous. It's in our Quran, رب اجعل هذا بلدا آمنا وارزق أهله من الثمرات. And maybe it is now the time.
Hey, I'm Mati Shoshani, and thank you for watching the TBN Israel YouTube channel. We hope this video gave you greater understanding of Israel and her people. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. We'd love to hear from you, so be sure to share what you've learned and ask your questions in comments below. And invite your friends to join the conversation.